In 1098, a Christian army fighting in the name of God did something so disturbing that their own leaders tried to hide it from history. Something that over a dozen eyewitnesses confirmed. Something that even the Pope was eventually told about, described as an act of cruel necessity. Something that the Muslim world never forgot, and that history books still struggle to fully explain. This is what happened when the Crusaders ran out of food. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the First Crusade actually was. In 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech that changed the world. He called on every Christian in Europe to march to the Holy Land and take Jerusalem back from Muslim rule. God wills it, he said, and tens of thousands of people believed him. What followed was one of the most chaotic and brutal military campaigns in history. Peasants, knights, priests, and criminals, all marching thousands of miles across unfamiliar terrain through harsh winters with almost no organized supply system. By the time the Crusader army reached Syria in late 1097, they were already exhausted, diseased, and running low on food. Then they encountered Antioch. Antioch was one of the most fortified cities in the world. Walls built by the Byzantine Empire, a garrison of thousands, impossible to take by storm. So the Crusaders did the only thing they could. They sat down outside the walls and waited. That decision nearly destroyed them. The Siege of Antioch lasted 8 months, from October 1097 to June 1098. 8 months outside the walls of a city that would not fall, in conditions that defied description. The surrounding countryside was stripped bare within weeks. Food became scarce, then rare, then almost non-existent. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, men ate leather, roots, leaves, anything. One chronicler recorded the prices in the Crusader camp. The head of a horse without the tongue sold for 2 or 3 silver shillings, the intestines of a goat for 5. These were not cheap prices. These were desperate men paying everything they had for scraps. By early 1098, 1 in 7 Crusaders was dying of starvation. 1 in 7. Not from battle, from hunger, sitting outside a city they could not take. And then something happened that the chronicles mention carefully, briefly, and without much detail. Among the poorest soldiers, a group called the Tafurs, men began eating the bodies of dead Turks. It was the first instance of what was coming. Antioch eventually fell in June 1098. The Crusaders were inside. They had won. But winning brought its own disaster. The city had been stripped of supplies during the long siege. The Crusaders, now inside, were barely better off than before. They moved on to a smaller city called Ma'ara in what is now Syria. Ma'ara was not a great military target. It was a waypoint, a city that sat on the road to Jerusalem that the Crusaders needed to control. The garrison was mostly untrained urban militia. The walls were strong but not impregnable. The Crusaders arrived in November 1098. They offered terms: surrender and your lives will be spared. The defenders refused. 2 weeks of failed assaults followed. The Crusaders built siege towers. On December 11th, they finally breached the walls. What happened next happened in 2 stages. First came the massacre. Despite the earlier promises of safe passage, the Crusaders killed nearly everyone inside. 20,000 people, soldiers and civilians alike, killed in the streets. Men, women, children. The city's defender had surrendered to Bohemond of Taranto personally, who had guaranteed their safety. It made no difference. Then came the squabbling. 2 Crusader leaders, Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse, began arguing over who controlled the city. The army sat. Days passed, then weeks, and the food ran out again. Unlike at Antioch, there were almost no horses left. The surrounding area had been stripped. The city's own stores were nearly empty. And surrounded by the bodies of 20,000 people they had just killed, the Crusaders made a decision. What followed is documented in over a dozen contemporary sources, including a letter written directly to Pope Urban II by the Crusade's own leaders. In that letter, they described their army as having been forced by cruel necessity into feeding itself upon the bodies of the Saracens. Chroniclers described soldiers cutting open the bodies of the dead, searching first for gold coins that might have been swallowed for safekeeping, and then cooking and eating the flesh. One account describes bodies being dragged outside the city and burned in large piles after the flesh had been taken. There is a debate among historians about whether hunger was truly the only reason. Some scholars point out something disturbing. The Crusaders ate only Muslim bodies, not their own dead. Some medieval sources suggest it was deliberate, a form of psychological warfare designed to terrify the Islamic world into believing they were facing something inhuman, something that would eat their dead. If that was the intention, it worked. The memory of Ma'arra traveled faster than any army. Muslim commanders who heard what had happened at that city made different decisions about resistance. Some surrendered rather than face what had happened to Ma'arra's defenders. The Crusaders had discovered that terror had military value. The leaders of the Crusade tried to manage what had happened. Most chronicles written by educated monks attempted to blame the events on the Tafurs, the poorest, most desperate segment of the Crusader army. Wild men, they were described, barely Christian, not representative of the true Crusaders. It was the medieval version of a few bad apples. But the letter to the Pope tells a different story. That letter wasn't written by Tafurs. It was written by the Crusade's highest leadership, and they weren't describing a fringe group's behavior. They were describing what their army had done. The Crusade continued to Jerusalem. In July 1099, the Holy City fell, and the Crusaders celebrated their victory by massacring nearly every inhabitant inside the walls, Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians alike. The First Crusade was celebrated in Europe as one of the greatest Christian military achievements in history. Churches held masses, kings sent congratulations, and in Syria, in the ruins of Ma'arra, the memory of what had happened there was passed down through generations of poetry and oral tradition. Here's what I think is most important about this story. The Crusaders who marched to the Holy Land genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They prayed before battle, they carried relics, they died believing they would be rewarded in heaven. And somewhere between that belief and the reality of 8 months outside Antioch's walls, between the starvation, the disease, the death, and the desperate violence, something broke. Not in one dramatic moment, gradually, incrementally, one compromise at a time, until what they were doing bore almost no resemblance to what they had set out to do. That is not a story unique to the Crusades. It is a story about what happens to human beings when they are pushed past the limits of what they can endure, and what they are willing to do when they believe the cause is righteous enough to justify it. Ma'arra is not mentioned in most history books about the Crusades. It probably should be.